everybody. Hope you are doing well today. Thank you for joining me today. This is the second part of Romans 15. So there's Romans 1 through 14 and the first part of Romans 15 back in the news feed if you want to go back and find those. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave those in the comment section below. I appreciate that feedback and conversation there. So if you could do that, I would appreciate it. And then also, if you could share this out with your friends list, I would appreciate it. That way we can increase the reach of these and the crowd that sees them. So I'd appreciate it if you could do that. So today we'll pick up in Romans 15, verse 14. So we're just continuing the conversation with yesterday. Like we said, Paul is kind of wrapping up the letter to the Romans at this point. And then tomorrow is the last chapter of Romans, and we'll go on to, I think we'll do Ephesians next. In verse 14, he talks about how he is happy that they, brothers in Christ here in Rome, are filled with goodness, filled with knowledge, and able to instruct one another. So this shows that the Christians in Rome were active in their faith. That they were, being good to each other. And as we saw the last couple of chapters, he was kind of rough on them and was pointing out some of their faults and things that they were working on. So he's kind of ending the chapter here with a encouragement to say, I'm happy with how good you are to each other, and that you guys are active in your faith and learning and teaching each other things. And 15, he addresses that but on some points I've written to you very boldly by way of reminder. But it says that he's done this because of the grace given to him by God. And so I just wanted to point out that sometimes when other believers point out things in our lives that aren't easy to deal with, it's not because of anything other than the grace of God speaking through them, that they are willing to do that, and that God is kind of giving us a check in that before we get too deep into something. And we talked about a little bit of that earlier, and that sometimes God challenges us and puts us in harder situations to get us out of something before we get too deep into it. And then 17 through 19 talks about how Paul is proud of his work in Christ Jesus, but it is clear to point out that he's only proud of what God's done and not what he's done. And it talks about in 18 how he's not going to speak about anything other than what Christ has accomplished, and not about his own actions. In verse 20 and 21, it talks about how his mission was to preach to the gospel to those that haven't heard. And so he's getting ready to talk about, in verse 22, it says, "This is the reason why I haven't been hindered from coming to you." And so it talks about how his mission is to reach the unreached people, the people that haven't heard the gospel, that haven't had a chance, excuse me, that haven't had a chance to hear of Christ's love and his dying for us. And so I think this kind of points out the difference between doing what's good and what God's called us to do. So, we know if he had gone on to Rome and spent some time there, it would have been good. It would have been a good thing. He could have encouraged the believers there, and they could have built him up. But it's saying that I can't do that because my mission, what God has called me to do and what God is leading me to do, is to reach these people. And so that's keeping me from doing the good thing of coming to see you. And so I think that's true in our lives as well. Sometimes we let the good get in the way of what God called us to, or what would be great for his kingdom. And so, we have to watch out for that. And then in verse 27, it talks about so he's talking about how he wants, he's going to see the church at Rome as he's passing through on his way to Spain, that, he feels like God is calling him to Spain next, but he has to go back by Jerusalem to deliver some donations that were given to him by the church at Macedonia and Achaia. And one thing I wanted to point out is that this verse, in verse 27, points out that there's a tie between receiving spiritual blessing and returning financial blessing or material blessing. So I know there's some debate or disagreement in the church about the tithe, and we won't go about that. We won't go into that. But verse 27 is clear, at least to me, that because it says, indeed they owe it to them, for if the Gentiles have come to share their spiritual blessing, they ought to be of service to them in material blessing. So I mean, that points out that if a ministry, if a church is being a spiritual blessing to us, then we kind of owe it to them to return some material blessing. And again, we're not going into the tithe, but I think that makes it clear, New Testament direction, that if you're receiving spiritual blessing from a church or from a ministry, that you should be returning some type of material blessing for that. And then it continues to talk about how he plans to visit with them after he, on the way to Spain. And then he wraps up this chapter and basically the book of Romans. And tomorrow he talks about giving salutations to different believers at the church at Rome. So we'll go through that tomorrow. But then in verse 30, he's talking about how, or he's asking the believers in Rome to pray for him. And he's asking them to pray for protection and blessing on his life. Basically protection from the unbelievers in Judea, and that his service would be acceptable to the saints, that it would build up the church. And then he wraps up in 33 by just praying for peace for them, and sends, may the God of peace be with you all. So he just kind of wraps up there and praying for the God of peace to reach out and touch the Romans there from a distance. So I think that kind of points out that he's praying for them and that he's concerned about their well-being. But yeah, so that's what I've got for Romans 15. Like I said, we'll do 16 tomorrow. I'm not sure how that'll go, but we'll give it a shot and at least try to point out some of the people he's greeting and why, and it should be interesting. We'll see how that goes tomorrow. Anyway, if you could like and comment this, I would appreciate it. If you've got any questions or comments, leave those below, and if you could share it out with your friends list, I would appreciate it. And have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.